The local park was quiet and peaceful on a warm spring day. Sunlight gently filtered through the branches of the trees, and the melodies of birds' trills mingled with children's laughter. A little black girl, confined to a wheelchair, sat not far from the alley, watching the children playing. Her eyes shone with joy, and her laughter was pure and sincere. Her father sat a little further away, casting attentive glances at his daughter, enjoying a brief moment of family happiness. But this tranquility was doomed to be cut short. A little farther down the alley, a man was walking. His face was stern, his steps sharp and quick. He looked around angrily, as if the whole world were a burden to him. The slightest noise, laughter, or casual glance irritated him. His clenched fists showed that he was looking for an excuse to vent his anger. A reason he soon found. His gaze fell on the girl in the wheelchair. He stopped, frowning, as if her presence somehow violated his personal space. Slowly, he walked toward her without taking his eyes off her. The girl, unsuspecting, was adjusting her brightly colored scarf, her face glowing with naive joy. But her father, catching the disturbing movement, began to watch the approaching man more closely. He walked closer and closer, his expression becoming more and more angry, as if the girl had done something personal to anger him. When the man stopped in front of her, the tension in the air was almost palpable. He stared at her with an expression as if her existence disgusted him. The few seconds of silence seemed like an eternity. Then, in a harsh and rough tone, he said, "You're only sitting here because everyone feels sorry for people like you. You think that makes you special?" The girl raised her eyes at him, full of incomprehension and fear. She didn't say a word, but her small hand gripped the armrest of the wheelchair tighter. The man, noticing her reaction, grinned, as if he had found confirmation of his silly theory. His voice grew louder, sharper, and he took a step closer. "People like you do nothing but parasitize normal people. What are you doing here? This is a place for people, not for—" His insulting tirade was cut short when he suddenly felt someone's gaze on him. But instead of stopping, the man decided that this situation was his opportunity to show his strength. It seemed to him that the whole world should accept his aggression. Meanwhile, the girl's father, who had left the paper on the bench, slowly rose. His eyes remained fixed on the man, and there was no longer any calmness in them, only cold, restrained anger. The man leaned closer to the girl, as if his anger needed to be heard, for someone to suffer its sharpness. His breath, heavy and hot, mingled with the harsh words he spat out with contempt. "You think someone should take care of people like you?" he began with a venomous grin. "You're just a burden. You can't even walk. How dare you take up places in this world that could be occupied by real people?" The girl squirmed in her stroller and looked away, trying not to look at his face. She quietly tried to remind herself of her father's words. "Ignore those who want to humiliate you. It's not about you, it's about them." But his voice, harsh and ruthless, felt like it was cutting her from the inside out. The man, seeing her silence, only grew angrier. He mistook her calmness for weakness. He needed more reaction, more pain. What, mute now, or too stupid to answer? He slammed the handle of her stroller so hard the metal creaked. "Your mother and father must think the world owes you everything. It's people like you that ruin the world." Passers-by began to slow their steps, looking around at what was happening. Some stopped, but only watched the situation from a distance. Most of them tried not to interfere, only furtively glancing around. One man pulled out his cell phone, but instead of calling for help, he started filming. Meanwhile, The girl squirmed in her chair, feeling her little world crumble under the weight of this hateful monologue. Her fingers gripped the arms of the chair painfully, and her lips trembled. She wanted to be strong, wanted to ignore, but the words were breaking through her defenses. The man continued as if each insulting sound lifted him higher. You know, there shouldn't even be people like you, right? Black people, handicapped people. Why do you even exist? You think this park is for people like you? It's a place for people, not trash. Every word he said was like a blow. She shrank like a leaf in a gust of wind, but she didn't cry. Her eyes glistened with restrained tears, but she fought not to give him that victory. But somewhere behind the man's back, a few meters away, a storm was already brewing. The girl's father stood as still as a statue, but his gaze burned with cold, merciless fire. It took all his self-control not to intervene instantly. He watched the man beat her with his words as no one around him intervened, and with each passing second, his restrained rage was gaining strength, ready to burst out. But the man, absorbed in his anger, did not notice any of this. He was losing himself more and more in his hatred. He took another step closer, almost looming over the girl. You and yours are so, useless, like those broken wheels of yours. You know what? Maybe I'll help you get rid of them. You don't need them anyway. His hand reached for the wheel of her wheelchair. The girl finally raised her head, her eyes filled with panicked terror. She wanted to scream, but the words stuck in her throat. It was at that moment that the silence was shattered by the rumbling sound of heavy footsteps, her father's footsteps. The man, who a moment ago had been spewing torrents of hatred with words, took a sharp step forward, his shadow falling on the girl, covering her like an ominous cloud. There was nothing in his eyes but a malice that seemed endless. He grabbed the handles of the wheelchair, and the metal creaked under his strong, nervous grip. The girl shuddered, her small fingers gripping the armrests, her eyes wide with fear. You think you can just sit there, pretending to be a victim? He hissed, holding the wheelchair as if he wanted to prove something of himself. What if I showed you what it was like to be truly helpless? With these words, he sharply yanked the stroller, lifting the front wheels off the ground. The girl shrieked, not expecting such harshness. Her body almost slipped out of the seat, but the straps held her up. The man seemed to enjoy her fright. He swung the stroller to the left, then to the right, as if testing it for strength. You're used to being pitied, aren't you? His voice grew louder and louder with each word. Did you think this park was for you? For people like you? What if we just cleaned it up? Her thin shoulders shook with held-back tears, but she didn't scream. She was afraid to show him how much he frightened her, but her small body gave everything away. The trembling, the clenched fingers, the quick breaths. She tried to look down at the ground, avoiding his gaze, but his voice was like sharp claws clawing at every fiber of her soul. People began to gather around. Some whispered, some took out their phones to film what was happening. However, no one dared to interfere. The crowd, as usual, froze, turning into passive witnesses, but it only fueled the man's desire to continue. He felt the power. Nobody's going to do anything, see? He dropped the words abruptly, turning around to look at those who were looking at him. Everyone knows I'm right. There's no need for people like you. You should be thanking me for showing you your place. His voice filled the air, vibrating like thunder. He shook the stroller again, so hard that one of the rear wheels came off the ground. The girl cried out fearfully, her arms clutched even tighter, and her body twisted almost completely sideways. Her lips trembled, but she still did not cry. And then he grinned, as if her fear was his reward. His rough fingers gripped one of the wheels as if he were going to yank it off in front of everyone. But it was at that moment that a change occurred, imperceptible to the man but perceptible to those watching. Footsteps, thudding, heavy footsteps echoed behind him. The girl's father, a tall, broad-shouldered man, approached slowly, as if weighing his every step. His face was calm, almost emotionless, but his eyes burned with rage. The crowd that had been watching in silence until then began to part, as if sensing the rising tension. The man in the wheelchair, too busy hating himself, did not yet realize that this approach would change everything. The girl, noticing her father's silhouette, raised her head for the first time. Her lips opened as if she wanted to say something, but the sound was stuck in her throat. Her eyes met her father's, and a spark of hope flickered in them, albeit mixed with panicked fear. The man at the stroller finally noticed the movement behind him and froze. He looked over his shoulder and met the icy gaze of the girl's father. At that moment, the silence became almost palpable. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. Everything froze before the inevitable storm. The man, feeling the stare of the girl's father, froze for a moment, but recovered quickly, as if his hatred was fueling his courage. He straightened up, one hand still holding the girl's wheelchair, the other waving roughly toward the approaching father. "Is that your daughter?" he shouted with mocking contempt, not taking his eyes off his prey. "Maybe you want me to teach you how to raise such useless freaks?" His words flew through the air like rusty nails, hurting all who heard them. The girl sobbed, but even at that moment she tried to keep from crying, her slender fingers still clinging tightly to the armrests of the chair. Her little world had crumbled in a few moments, and now she felt insignificant in front of this man who embodied for her all the horror and cruelty of the world. The man, seeing that her father continued to approach, laughed, low and angry, like a wild beast. His laughter was filled with contempt. "What? You think you can stop me? You're all the same. You think you belong here, among us, among normal people?" He grabbed the stroller again and shoved it sideways so that the girl almost flew out of it. "But you're just dirt that spoils our lives." The stroller tilted with a creak, but the man apparently found it insufficient. His eyes burned with savage hatred, and he lifted it as if he were going to throw it. "That's a lesson for you." He gritted through his teeth, and before anyone could intervene, he shoved the stroller to the ground. The metal crunched, the wheels flew off to the side, and the plastic armrests cracked, splintering into the grass. The girl fell to the ground with a thud, her thin arms trying to cushion her fall, but she still hit. Her eyes were dazed and her lips trembled with suppressed sobs. She was lying on the ground, shards of her wheelchair, her only means of transportation, all around her. It wasn't just physical destruction, it was humiliation. She had been rendered helpless in front of everyone who stood and watched. She could not hold back the tears that streamed down her cheeks. The man raised his hands as if proudly declaring his victory and looked around at the others. His voice once again broke the tense silence. "You see, that's what they deserve," he shouted, pointing at the girl. "They're taking our places, stealing our future. People like her are a disgrace to us all." His gloating knew no bounds. He turned again to the girl's father, who was now standing only a few feet away. The man smirked, challenging him. "What? You got something to say? Or are you just going to lie there like her?" But the girl's father was no longer listening. His calmness was deceptive. Beneath that unmoving mask was a power that was about to explode. His gaze stayed fixed on his daughter. Her tears, her trembling, her humiliation. All this was the last straw. The crowd froze, holding its breath. The man did not yet know that his own fall had already begun. The girl's father stood nearby, seemingly lost in the crowd. His powerful figure seemed motionless, but inside him a hurricane was raging. He saw the man reaching for his daughter, his hateful words tearing at her fragile heart. He saw her small hands clench as she struggled to hold on, her eyes filled with terror, darting around for salvation. And he could not forget it. Inside him, rage was tearing at him, but it was as cold as steel. Not a scream, not an outburst, but something far worse. It was the silence before the storm, that state when the whole world shrinks to a single purpose. The man continued his brutal actions, tearing her wheelchair apart, breaking her not only physically but mentally. And the father knew. Every second of his inaction would cost him nights spent in the agony of memories. But he had to wait for the moment. He had to wait to strike so that this man would never forget the price of his hatred. The crowd watched. No one interfered. Some whispered their condemnation, some turned away, and some unashamedly filmed the whole thing on their phones as another spectacle for social media. But no one dared to step forward. No one dared to put an end to this hatred. They're afraid, my father thought. Afraid they will be hurt by that same anger. Afraid of him, this insignificant but loud man. His fists clenched tighter and tighter. Every splinter of the broken stroller, every cry of his daughters, slammed into his mind like a hammer blow. He saw the girl struggling to get up, her thin arms sliding across the grass. The man bent over her, continuing his tirade. "Look, now you're where you're supposed to be, on the ground," he shouted, laughing again. "That's where you belong, among the mud." Every word, every movement of this man was like a knife in my father's back. But he didn't move. Not yet. His time had not yet come. He watched, coldly, aloofly, but there was a rage burning inside him that would soon erupt. His gaze fell on those gathered around him. He saw the fear in their eyes. They saw what this man could do to the girl, and they knew he would not stop. Someone tried to take a step forward, but immediately backed away, afraid of the man's aggression. The sight added depth to the father's anger, not only toward his attacker, but also toward the crowd that had chosen passivity. He heard no more words. He saw his daughter lying on the ground, her thin fingers trembling and tears streaming from her eyes. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading for protection. And in that moment, he realized that he could not wait any longer. He took a step forward, slow, steady, almost silent. His massive figure seemed to grow out of nowhere, like a thundercloud ready to crash to the ground. The crowd parted before him, as if sensing his approach in anger. His gaze was fixed, cold, almost unnatural. There was not a hint of weakness in it, only focus, only strength. The man at the wheelchair, sensing movement behind him, turned around. Confusion flashed in his eyes for a moment, but he quickly returned to his former insolence. "Who are you? Another one who won't talk? Or do you want to know your place too?" he said mockingly, tossing the splinter of the baby carriage aside. His father stopped just a few feet away from him. The crowd held its breath. The girl looked up, her trembling lips trying to utter a word, but silence, like a thunderous calm, hung over the park. It was into this silence that the father slowly but inexorably broke through. "You've just made your last mistake." The crowd stood as if spellbound, as if the violent scene unfolding before them was not reality, but something distant, as if from a movie or someone else's dream. Some were taking pictures on their phones, some were looking away, clearly uncomfortable, but no one moved. A woman with a baby stroller stopped for a few seconds, looked around, saw the scene, and, hurrying the baby away, hurried away as if that would save her from being involved in the situation. The young man in the headphones frowned, but only added a step, avoiding making eye contact with what was happening. The man, still standing over the girl, noticed this. He saw their hesitation, their acquiescence, and it only fueled his anger. He felt stronger, more confident. His laughter echoed through the silent park, sinister and harsh as a lash. "Look at her!" he shouted loudly, addressing the crowd. His voice cut through the air, causing many to stop and look around. "Is this your heroine? Are these the ones you fight so hard for? People like her, all they know how to do is whine and wait for handouts." He leaned toward the girl again, as if to demonstrate how much he despised her. "You see? No one's going to help. No one's going to step forward, because everyone knows that no one wants people like you. You're a mistake, a blight on this world." The girl, still lying on the ground among the wreckage of her chair, was silent. Her face was tearful, her body trembling with horror and humiliation. She tried to rise, but could not. Each attempt seemed another triumph for the man who stood over her like a shadow that swallowed up all light. The crowd began to whisper. "Why doesn't anyone do anything?" whispered one woman. "Are you coming?" The man beside her replied, nervously clenching his hand into a fist. "He looks dangerous. It's none of our business." "It's just a kid," someone muttered from the middle of the crowd. "Someone has to do something." But no one did. The man heard those words, turned around and frowned, casting a fierce glance toward the crowd. The people fell silent, averting their eyes. His smile returned. He knew they wouldn't intervene. They were afraid, and that gave him even more confidence. He picked up the splinter of the baby carriage again like a trophy and threw it to the ground with a thud. "That's it? Everything you have is trash, just like yourselves." He laughed again, turning to the crowd. "Do you want people like her to be equal to us, with normal people? And you all just stand there, watching me show her where she belongs." Some of the passers-by turned away, as if hoping that leaving their sight would relieve them of their guilt. Others stood as if paralyzed. Phone cameras captured every detail, but no one made a call. No one rushed forward. The man, seeing this, loosened up even more. He sharply pushed the remains of the stroller with his foot, scattering the debris. "You think this world is for everyone? You're wrong," he shouted, waving his arms. "It is for us, for the strong, not for these broken, useless creatures." He turned to the girl, bending toward her again, his face contorted with anger. "Tell them thank you," he hissed. "Be thankful that no one dared to stand up for you, because no one wants you." But at that moment, something changed. The silence of the crowd was broken by one heavy step, then a second. The girl's father, who had been watching this soulless tirade trample everything human, stepped forward. His face was calm, but there was an icy determination in his eyes that would have made even the bravest man tremble. The crowd, seeing his approach, backed away slightly. The man, standing over the girl, looked over his shoulder and saw a figure approaching him with unrelenting certainty. This was no mere man. It was the embodiment of rage, anger, and justice that no one expected. And now, for the first time in all this time, the man felt a slight chill down his spine. The crowd, hitherto silent and inert, seemed to split in two, forming a narrow passage through which the girl's father approached. Every step he took sounded like the sounding of a bell, announcing the coming storm. His face was impassive, but there was an icy menace in that calmness that made even the air around him seem heavier. The man, standing over the girl, noticed his approach. His eyes flashed with concern for a moment, but it was quickly replaced by his usual contempt. He tossed the wreck of the stroller aside and grinned. "Finally," he said loudly, turning around to face the girl's father. "Have you decided to come out of your hole? You think you can do something? People like you don't know how to defend. You're weak, just like her." The father stopped only a few steps away from the man. His gaze slid for a moment to his daughter, who was still lying on the ground, her small hands trying to hold back a shiver. He lowered his eyes to the wreckage of her stroller, broken like her pride. His breathing remained even, but every muscle in his body was tense, like a spring ready to unravel. "You had a chance to leave," he said quietly, but in a way that made his words sound louder than all the shouting before. Now it was gone. The crowd held its breath. The man in front of him suddenly felt that this man was nothing like the men he had humiliated before. Behind that outward restraint was a threat he couldn't ignore. "Ah, so you decided to play the hero." The aggressor grinned, trying to maintain his bravado. "You think you can intimidate me? You're just like her, a weakling. One blow and you'll collapse." Father didn't answer. Instead, he took another step forward, minimizing the distance. And then the crowd began to notice details that had previously escaped their attention. The tattoos, barely visible under the collar of his shirt, that reminded them he belonged to a military special forces unit. The straight posture, the look of years of experience. This was no ordinary man. The man in front of him began to lose confidence. His usual intimidation tactics weren't working. This wasn't a case of the victim keeping quiet or walking away. This man didn't look like he was about to leave. Moreover, he looked like he was in complete control of the situation. "Who are you, anyway?" the aggressor shouted, not as confident as before. "Do you think your ponces mean anything? Go away before I break you like I broke her wheelchair." And at that moment, my father spoke louder for the first time. His voice was hard as steel, and every word sounded like a sentence. "I'm a man who doesn't abandon his family. I'm the man who won't let someone like you touch my daughter. And, most importantly," he paused, still keeping his eyes on the man, "I'm the man who will break you if you take another step." The crowd gasped. The man was speechless for a moment. He tried to answer, but his father suddenly moved forward with such speed that no one had time to understand. In one swift movement, he seized the aggressor by the hand that a second ago had been pointing at him with menace. The grip was so strong that the man cried out in pain. "You think you're strong because the others were silent?" his father whispered, his voice right next to the man's ear. "I'll show you what strength is." With those words, he shoved the man backward, knocking him to the ground. The crowd recoiled, watching as the aggressor's confidence instantly evaporated. The man, now lying on the ground, tried to shout something, but his words were drowned in fear. And then his father uttered a final warning, addressing not only him, but everyone watching. "It is your choice to stand by and watch the weak suffer, or to stand up for them. Today I have shown you how to do that, but let it be a lesson to all of you." The aggressor did not rise again. He remained lying there, trembling, realizing that on this day he faced not just a man, but a force that surpassed him on every level. Father slowly bent over the man who now lay on the ground, pathetic and lost. His face remained calm, but his voice, low, almost hissing, was imbued with a cold rage that felt physical. "Stand up," he said quietly, but there was no request in his words, only a command. "Stand up and look me in the eye." The crowd froze, waiting to see what would happen next. The aggressor, fists clenched, slowly rose to his feet. His self-confidence evaporated, but his anger remained. He tried to maintain the remnants of his dignity, smirking. "You think you can intimidate me?" he snapped, taking a step back to put some distance between them. "I'm not afraid of people like you. You're just a big guy who thinks he can solve everything with his fists." His father stepped forward, closing the distance so quickly that the man almost stumbled. His eyes were fixed on the aggressor's face, and there was not a hint of fear in them. "It's not your fists," he said calmly, but his voice grew louder with each word. "It's how far you're willing to go to protect your loved ones. And you touched my daughter. You broke her stroller. You laughed while she was on the ground. And now you want to talk about fear?" His voice became raspy, his last words sounding like they were spoken in a court of law. "I'll show you what fear means." The man looked around nervously at the crowd. He tried to find support, a single sympathetic face, but he found only indifferent and in some cases judgmental looks. No one else was on his side. "Do you think I'm afraid?" he shouted, though his voice trembled. "Do you think you can defeat me? You're finished if you raise your hand against me." His father leaned sharply toward him, their faces a few centimeters apart. "I will not raise my hand against you," he said coldly. "I'll raise your soul so you can see how pathetic you are. You destroyed her wheelchair, but you don't even realize that it wasn't her body you broke. You tried to break her spirit, and for that, I'm going to make you realize what it means to be weak." With those words, the father slowly straightened up, but the man suddenly snapped. Apparently, his anger overcame his fear. He lunged forward, swinging his fist at his father. It was a mistake. Dad dodged with a precision that shocked the crowd. His movements were quick, like a professional trained by years of training. He grabbed the aggressor's arm and twisted it sharply behind his back, causing him to cry out in pain. "I gave you a chance to leave," his father said, squeezing the man's hand so that he fell to his knees. "But you chose this path. Now look where it's taken you." "Let me go," the man shouted, his voice no longer threatening, only pleading. You have no right." His father leaned slowly toward his ear. "I have the right to protect my daughter, and I will protect her always." He released the man with a sharp jerk so that he fell face first into the grass. The crowd held its breath, not knowing what would happen next. The man rose slowly, his hands trembling, no longer looking at his father. You're going to pay for this," he shouted, stumbling backward. "You think it's just going to end like this? It will end," his father interrupted him, his voice like a bell ringing. "This is where it ends, because you're going to walk out of here now, and you will never, ever, ever touch her or anyone else again." The man stood like a hunted animal, but then, seeing that the crowd was clearly on his father's side, he turned and started to walk away, throwing something unintelligible and impotent into the air. My father remained standing, staring after him until he was out of sight. The crowd was silent. All attention was focused on him. He turned and looked at his daughter, who was lying on the ground, and his face softened. He walked over to her, lifted her gently in his arms, and held her close to him. "It's okay, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice shaking with suppressed emotion. "It's over. I'm with you." And in that moment, everyone around him realized this man was not only strong, he was a shield, a defense, someone who would never give up in the face of injustice. The man ran down the alley, his back slouching as if under the weight of his own shame. The crowd watched him with silent condemnation, but no one rushed after him except for one thing: his own guilt, which, like a shadow, would haunt him to the end. But that wasn't all. He stopped behind the trees, trying to catch his breath, looking around nervously. It seemed to him that the tall, formidable man was still behind him. He could feel his gaze, hear his footsteps, even if it was all just a play of imagination. But the real danger was not gone. It only lurked. Not a moment later, he heard someone's slow, measured footsteps behind him. The man turned around, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the girl's father. He stood still, like a shadow, unmoving and intimidating. "Did you think you could just walk away?" his father said, his voice like the quiet thunder that heralds a storm. "Did you think you could put this behind you? Number today. You're going to find out what it's like to be broken." The man backed away, his back against the tree trunk. His self-confidence had long since melted away, but he was still trying to resist. "Minus I didn't do anything to make this go on," he shouted, his voice high, broken. "You have no right to come after me. I'm the one who'll call the police." Father took a step forward, and then another. Each step was precise and inexorable, like the footsteps of fate. When he was only a meter away from the man, he tried again to shout something, but the words stuck in his throat. "The police?" Dad grinned, but there was more threat than joy in that laugh. "That's a good idea. Let's make the call. Let them see all these people's tapes. Let them see how you humiliated the baby, how you broke her stroller. Are you ready to explain your actions to them?" The man fell silent. He knew his father was right. He knew that every second of his aggression was caught on camera. The crowd would not remain silent if it came to a real investigation. He wanted to respond, but his father didn't give him the chance. "Do you think they're just words?" he continued. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but that made it sound even scarier. "Do you think this is all going to end now? Number. You'll remember this day. You'll remember how your hatred turned against you." His father leaned sharply toward him, their faces on the same level. "Look at me," he said, and the man couldn't look away, no matter how much he wanted to. "I want you to see the face of a man who protects his loved ones. I want you to realize that there are more people like me than there are people like you. And every time you think about raising your hand or voice to someone weaker than you again, you'll remember me. You'll remember that I'm there for you, even when I'm not." The man was shaking like an aspen leaf. His eyes darted from side to side, but they invariably returned to the calm but icy gaze of the girl's father. He tried to say something, but the sounds came out incoherent. You can't," he began, but his father raised his hand sharply, stopping him from speaking. "I can," he interrupted, "and I will. You're going to walk out of here empty inside, because today you've lost everything. Your dignity, your pride, your power. You are nothing, and you know it." The man fell to his knees, his hands clutching his head. It was a collapse, complete and utter. His hatred, his aggression, everything he had thought was his strength, had turned against him. He was now the one who was reviled, the one who was despised. The crowd would not forget how he had broken the child, how he had laughed at her suffering. The father slowly straightened up, but his gaze remained fixed on the broken man. Then he turned and walked back to his daughter, leaving behind him only the sounds of sobs and a shattered human ego. The crowd parted before him. No one dared say a word, but everyone knew they were witnessing more than a fight. It was a lesson for all who watched. The price of hatred was too high. The crowd in the park still remained motionless, as if shrouded in an oppressive silence. People watched as the man who only a few minutes ago had been spewing hatred now lay on the ground, broken not physically but mentally. His confidence had evaporated, replaced by fear and despair. Without another word, the girl's father headed back to his daughter, leaving behind the man he had made realize the depth of his fall. He walked over to the girl, who was now sitting on the grass. Her eyes were still red with tears, but there was a spark of hope in them when she saw her father. He bent down, lifted her gently in his arms as if she were the most precious treasure, and held her close to him. "It's over, baby," he whispered, his voice shaking with emotion. "I'm with you. No one will ever hurt you again." The crowd around them began to whisper, and there were those among the people who finally dared to come closer. The woman who was holding the phone said quietly, "I took it all down. If you need this man to answer for his actions, you have proof." Another man added, "And I'm ready to testify. No one should have to put up with this." Their words were the first signal that indifference had given way to awareness. They realized that silence was complicity, that their fear had allowed the aggressor to go so far. Father thanked them with a nod. His gaze was no longer full of rage, but a firm determination. He knew that justice had to be done, not only for his daughter's sake, but also so that this would never happen again. A few days later, the man who humiliated the girl stood before the court. The video taken in the park was evidence that could not be refuted. His own words, spoken with hatred and contempt, echoed through the courtroom, making everyone present feel the weight of his anger. The judge listened attentively to the testimony of the witnesses and then read the verdict. "Your actions are the epitome of how destructive hate can be," he said, looking at the defendant. "You humiliated a child who could not defend herself. You used her weakness to make her feel powerful. But today you will learn that such power is an illusion. You will receive the punishment you deserve." The man was sentenced to corrective work and a fine, and was required to undergo a tolerance education program. But what broke him most of all was the public condemnation. People who might once have passed him by now saw him as someone who epitomized the worst aspects of society. For the girl and her family, that day was a lesson not only about injustice, but also about resilience. Her father replaced the broken wheelchair with a new one, but more importantly, he replaced her sense of fear with the certainty that she would never be alone. They went back to the same park. The girl sat in the sun again, watching the other children. Her smile was back, but now there was a strength in it that said, "I'm not afraid anymore." Her father stood beside her, his eyes following her with warmth and pride. He knew that this lesson was important not only for them, but for everyone who witnessed that day. Hate cannot win if there are those who are willing to fight for justice. The story was over, but its reverberations remained in the hearts of those who saw it with their own eyes. People began to realize that indifference feeds evil. Only action, courage, and compassion can put it in its place. That was the main lesson. Hate can be defeated. It loses its power when people unite against it, and the truth, as always, remains the strongest. Friends, we hope that this story made you think and evoked strong emotions. Write in the comments what you think about what happened. Have you experienced racism or injustice in your life? How have you reacted in these situations? Your stories and thoughts are incredibly important to us. We value each and every one of you and are always happy to hear what you think. If you support the idea of justice and equality, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with new stories. Give us a like if you think hate should have no place in our world, and share this video with your friends so that more people can learn about the importance of fighting injustice. Thank you for being with us. We wish you a wonderful day filled with kindness and warmth.